Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing our series in Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 23, The Mirage of Inflation. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, which we just wrapped up a few weeks ago. So I'll put a link in this video's descriptions to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, we'll be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read. So I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to the analysis and review part of the video so you can jump straight to that if that's how you'd like to go about things. Final thing before we get started. As he has done in previous reads, Hazlitt has broken this section up because it's kind of on the long side into 6 parts. He's labeled them entirely numerically and has not labeled part 1. So I'll be inserting part 1 after I read the title. So without further ado, with all that out of the way, let's dive into tonight's read, which is Chapter 23, The Mirage of Inflation. I have found it necessary to warn the reader from time to time that a certain result would necessarily follow from a certain policy, quote, provided there is no inflation, end quote. In the chapters on public works and on credit, I said that a study of the complications introduced by inflation would have to be deferred. But money and monetary policy form so intimate and sometimes so inextricable a part of every economic process that this separation, even for expository purposes, was very difficult. And in the chapters on the effect of various government or union wage policies on employment, profits, and production, some of the effects of differing monetary policies had to be considered immediately. Before we consider what the consequences of inflation are in specific cases, we should consider what its consequences are in general. Even prior to that, it seems desirable to ask why inflation has been constantly resorted to, why it has had an immemorial popular appeal, and why its siren music has tempted one nation after another down the path to economic disaster. The most obvious and yet the oldest and most stubborn error on which the appeal of inflation rests is that of confusing quote-unquote money with wealth. Quote, that wealth consists in money, or in gold and silver, wrote Adam Smith more than 2 centuries ago, is a popular notion which naturally arises from the double function of money, as the instrument of commerce and as the measure of value. To grow rich is to get money, and wealth and money, in short, are, in common language, considered as in every respect synonymous. End quote. Real wealth, of course, consists in what is produced and consumed, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the houses we live in. It is railways and roads and motor cars, ships and planes and factories, schools and churches and theaters, pianos, paintings, and books. Yet so powerful is the verbal ambiguity that confuses money with wealth that even those who at times recognize the confusion will slide back into it in the course of their reasoning. Each man sees that if he personally had more money, he could buy more things from others. If he had twice as much money as he could buy twice as many things. If he had 3 times as much money, he would be quote-unquote worth 3 times as much. And to many, the conclusion seems obvious that if the government merely issued more money and distributed to everybody, we should all be that much richer. These are the most naive inflationists. There is a second group, less naive, who see that if the whole thing were as easy as that, the government could solve all our problems merely by printing money. They sense that there must be a catch somewhere, so they would limit in some way the amount of additional money they would have the government issue. They would have it print just enough to make up some alleged quote-unquote deficiency or quote-unquote gap. Purchasing power is chronically deficient, they think, because industry somehow does not distribute enough money to producers to enable them to buy back as consumers the product that is made. There is a mysterious quote-unquote leak somewhere. One group, quote-unquote, proves its equations. On one side of their equations, they count an item only once. On the other side, they unknowingly count the same item several times over. This produces an alarming gap between what they call, quote, A payments and what they call, quote unquote, A plus B payments. So they found a movement, put on green uniforms, and insist that the government issue money or quote unquote credits to make good the missing B payments. The cruder apostles of quote unquote social credit may seem ridiculous, but there are an indefinite number of schools of only slightly more sophisticated inflationists who have quote unquote scientific plans to issue just enough additional money or credit to fill some alleged chronic or periodic deficiency or gap, which they calculate in some other way. Part 2. The more knowing inflationists recognize that any substantial increase in the quantity of money will reduce the purchasing power of each individual monetary unit. In other words, that it will lead to an increase in commodity prices. But this does not disturb them. On the contrary, it is precisely why they want the inflation. Some of them argue that this result will improve the position of poor debtors as compared with rich creditors. Others think it will stimulate exports and discourage imports. Still others think it is an essential measure to cure a depression, to quote-unquote start industry going again, and to achieve quote-unquote full employment. There are innumerable theories concerning the way in which increased quantities of money, including bank credit, affect prices. On the one hand, as we have just seen, are those who imagine that the quantity of money could be increased by almost any amount without affecting prices. They merely see this increased money as a means of increasing everyone's quote-unquote purchasing power in the sense of enabling everybody to buy more goods than before. Either they never stop to remind themselves that people collectively cannot buy twice as much goods as before unless twice as much goods are produced, or they imagine that the only thing that holds down an indefinite increase in production is not a shortage of manpower, working hours, or productive capacity, but merely a shortage of monetary demand. If people want the goods, they assume, and have the money to pay for them, the goods will almost automatically be produced. On the other hand is the group, and it has included some eminent economists, that holds a rigid mechanical theory of the effect of the supply of money on commodity prices. All the money in a nation, as these theorists picture the matter, will be offered against all the goods. Therefore, the value of the total quantity of money multiplied by its quote-unquote velocity of circulation must always be equal to the value of the total quantity of goods bought. Therefore, further, assuming no change in velocity of circulation, the value of the monetary unit must vary exactly and inversely with the amount put into circulation. Double the quantity of money in bank credit, and you exactly double the quote-unquote price level. Triple it, and you exactly triple the price level. Multiply the quantity of money n times, in short, and you must multiply the prices of goods n times. There is not space here to explain all the fallacies in this plausible picture. Instead, we shall try to see just why and how an increase in the quantity of money raises prices. An increased quantity of money comes into existence in a specific way. Let us say that it comes into existence because the government makes larger expenditures than it can, or wishes to meet out of the proceeds of taxes, or from the sale of bonds paid for by the people out of real savings. Suppose, for example, that the government prints money to pay war contractors. Then the first effect of these expenditures will be to raise the prices of supplies used in war and to put additional money into the hands of the war contractors and their employers. This next part is parenthetical. As in our chapter on price fixing, we deferred for the sake of simplicity some complications introduced by inflation, so, in now considering inflation, we may pass over the complications introduced by an attempt at government price fixing. When these are considered, it will be found that they do not change the essential analysis. They lead merely to a sort of backed up or quote-unquote repressed inflation that reduces or conceals some of the earlier consequences at the expense of aggravating the later ones. Close parentheses. The war contractors and their employees, then, will have higher monetary incomes. They will spend them for the particular goods and services they want. The sellers of these goods and services will be able to raise their prices because of this increased demand. Those who have the increased money income will be willing to pay these higher prices rather than do without the goods, for they will have more money, and the dollar will have a smaller subjective value in the eyes of each of them. Let us call the war contractors and their employees Group A, and those from whom they directly buy their added goods and services Group B. Group B, as a result of higher sales and prices, will now in turn buy more goods and services from a still further group, C. Group C, in turn, will be able to raise its prices and will have more income to spend on Group D, and so on, until the rise in prices and money incomes has covered virtually the whole nation. When the process has been completed, nearly everybody will have a higher income measured in terms of money. But, assuming that production of goods and services has not increased, prices of goods and services will have increased correspondingly. The nation will be no richer than before. This does not mean, however, that everyone's relative or absolute wealth and income will remain the same as before. On the contrary, the process of inflation is certain to affect the fortunes of one group differently from those of another. The first groups to receive the additional money will benefit the most. The money incomes of Group A, for example, will have increased before prices have increased, so that they will be able to buy almost a proportionate increase in goods. The money incomes of Group B will advance later, when prices have already increased somewhat, but Group B will be better off in terms of goods. Meanwhile, however, the groups that have still had no advance whatsoever in their money incomes will find themselves compelled to pay higher prices for the things they buy, which means that they will be obliged to get along on a lower standard of living than before. We may clarify the process further by a hypothetical set of figures. Suppose we divide the community arbitrarily into four main groups of producers, A, B, C, and D, who get the money income benefit of the inflation in that order. Then when money incomes of Group A have already increased 30%, the price of the things they purchase have not yet increased at all. By the time money incomes of Group B have increased 20%, prices have still increased an average of only 10%. When money incomes of Group C have increased only 10%, however, prices have already gone up 15%. And when money incomes of Group D have not yet increased at all, the average prices they have to pay for the things they buy have gone up 20%. In other words, the gains of the first groups of producers to benefit by higher prices or wages from the inflation are necessarily at the expense of the losses suffered as consumers by the last groups of producers that are able to raise their prices or wages. It may be that, if the inflation is brought to a halt after a few years, the final result will be, say, an average increase of 20%, 25% in monetary incomes, and an average increase in prices of an equal amount, both of which are fairly distributed among all groups. But this will not cancel out the gains and losses of the transition period. Group D, for example, even though its own incomes and prices have at last advanced to 25%, will be able to buy only as much goods and services as before the inflation started. It will never compensate for its losses during the period when its incomes and prices had not risen at all, though it had to pay up to 30% more for the goods and services it bought from other producing groups in the community A, B, and C. Part 3. So inflation turns out to be merely one more example of our central lesson. It may indeed bring benefits for a short time to favored groups, but only at the expense of others. and in the long run it brings ruinous consequences to the whole community. Even a relatively mild inflation distorts the structure of production. It leads to expansion of some industries at the expense of others. This involves a misapplication and waste of capital. When the inflation collapses or is brought to a halt, the misdirected capital investment, whether in the form of machines, factories, or office buildings, cannot yield an adequate return and loses the greater part of its value. Nor is it possible to bring inflation to a smooth and gentle stop, and so avert a subsequent depression. It is not even possible to halt an inflation once embarked upon at some preconceived point, or when prices have achieved a previously agreed upon level, for both political and economic forces will have got out of hand. You cannot make an argument for a 25% advance in prices by inflation without someone's contending that the argument is twice as good for an advance of 50% and someone else is adding that it is 4 times as good for an advance of 100%. The political pressure groups that have benefited from the inflation will insist upon its continuance. It is impossible, moreover, to control the value of money under inflation. For as we have seen, the causation is never merely a mechanical one. You cannot, for example, say in advance that a 100% increase in the quantity of money will mean a 50% fall in the value of the monetary unit. The value of money, as we have seen, depends upon the subjective valuations of the people who hold it. And those valuations do not depend solely on the quantity of it that each person holds. They depend also on the quality of the money. In wartime, the value of a nation's monetary unit, not on the gold standard, will rise on the foreign exchanges with victory and fall with defeat, regardless of changes in its quantity. The present valuation will often depend upon what people expect the future quantity of money to be, and, as with commodities on the speculative exchanges, each person's valuation of money is affected not only by what he thinks its value is, but what he thinks is going to be everyone else's valuation of money. All this explains why, when hyperinflation has once set in, the value of the monetary unit drops at a far faster rate than the quantity of money either is or can be increased. When this stage is reached, the disaster is nearly complete and the scheme is bankrupt. Part 4. Yet the ardor for inflation never dies. It would almost seem as if no country is capable of profiting from the experience of another and no generation of learning from the sufferings of its forebears. Each generation and country follows the same mirage. Each grasps for the same Dead Sea fruit that turns to dust and ashes in its mouth. For it is the nature of inflation to give birth to 1,000 illusions. In our own day, the most persistent argument put forward for inflation is that it will, quote, get the wheels of industry turning, end quote, that it will save us from the irretrievable losses of stagnation and idleness and bring, quote unquote, full employment. This argument in its cruder form rests on the immemorial confusion between money and real wealth. It assumes that the new, quote unquote, purchasing power is being brought into existence, and that the effects of this new purchasing power multiply themselves in ever-widening circles, like the ripples caused by a stone thrown into a pond. The real purchasing power for goods, however, as we have seen, consists of other goods. It cannot be wondrously increased merely by printing more pieces of paper called dollars. Fundamentally, what happens in an exchange economy is that the things that A produces are exchanged for the things that B produces. What inflation really does is to change the relationships of prices and costs. The most important change it is designed to bring about is to raise commodity prices in relation to wage rates, and so to restore business profits and encourage a resumption of output at the points where idle resources exist, by restoring a workable relationship between prices and costs of production. it should be immediately clear that this could be brought about more directly and honestly by a reduction in unworkable wage rates. But the more sophisticated proponents of inflation believe that this is now politically impossible. Sometimes they go further and charge that all proposals, under any circumstances to reduce particular wage rates directly in order to reduce unemployment, are quote-unquote anti-labor. But what they are themselves proposing, stated in bald terms, is to deceive labor by reducing real wage rates, that is, wage rates in terms of purchasing power, through an increase in prices. What they forget is that labor has itself become sophisticated, that the big unions employ labor economists who know about index numbers, and that labor is not deceived. The policy, therefore, under present conditions, seems unlikely to accomplish either its economic or its political aims. For it is precisely the most powerful unions, whose wage rates are most likely to be in need of correction, that will insist that their wage rates be raised, at least in proportion to any increase in the cost of living index. The workable relationships between prices and key wage rates, if the insistence of the powerful unions prevails, will remain. The wage rate structure, in fact, may become even more distorted, for the great mass of unorganized workers, whose wage rates even before the inflation were not out of line, and may even have been unduly depressed through union exclusionisms, will be penalized further during the transition by the rise in prices. Part 5. The more sophisticated advocates of inflation, in brief, are disingenuous. They do not state their case with complete candor, and they end by deceiving even themselves. They begin to talk of paper money, like the more naive inflationists, as if it were itself a form of wealth that could be created at will on the printing press. They even solemnly discuss a quote-unquote multiplier, by which every dollar printed and spent by the government becomes magically the equivalent of several dollars added to the wealth of the country. In brief, they divert both the public attention and their own from the real causes of any existing depression. For the real causes, most of the time, are maladjustments within the wage-cost price structure. Maladjustments between wages and prices, between prices of raw materials and prices of finished goods, or between one price and another, or one wage and another. At some point, these maladjustments have removed the incentive to produce, or have made it actually impossible for production to continue, and through the organic interdependence of our exchange economy, depression spreads. Not until these maladjustments are corrected can full production and employment be resumed. True, inflation may sometimes correct them, but it is a heady and dangerous method. It makes its corrections not openly and honestly, but by the use of illusion. Inflation, indeed, throws a veil of illusion over every economic process. It confuses and deceives almost everyone, including even those who suffer by it. We are all accustomed to measuring our income and wealth in terms of money. The mental habit is so strong that even professional economists and statisticians cannot consistently break it. It is not easy to see relationships always in terms of real goods and real welfare. Who among us does not feel richer and prouder when he is told that our national income has doubled, in terms of dollars, of course, compared with some pre-inflationary period? Even the clerk who used to get $75 a week and now gets $120 thinks that he must be in some way better off, though it costs him twice as much to live as it did when he was getting $75. He is, of course, not blind to the rise in the cost of living, but neither is he fully aware of his real position as he would have been if his cost of living had not changed, and if his money salary had been reduced to give him the same reduced purchasing power that he now has, in spite of his salary increase because of higher prices. Inflation is the autosuggestion, the hypnotism, the anesthetic that has dulled the pain of the operation for him. Inflation is the opium of the people. Part 6. And this is precisely its political function. It is because inflation confuses everything that it is so consistently resorted to by our modern quote-unquote planned economy governments. We saw in Chapter 4, to take but one example, that the belief that public works necessarily creates new jobs is false. If the money was raised by taxation, we saw, then for every dollar that the government spent on public works, one less dollar was spent by the taxpayers to meet their own wants, and for every public job created, one private job was destroyed. But suppose the public works are not paid for from the proceeds of taxation. Suppose they are paid for by deficit financing, that is, from the proceeds of government borrowing, or from resorts to the printing press. Then the result just described does not seem to take place. The public works seem to be created out of new purchasing power. You cannot say that the purchasing power has been taken away from the taxpayers. For the moment the nation seems to have got something for the moment that the nation seems to have got something for nothing. But now, in accordance with our lesson, let us look at the longer consequences. The borrowing must someday be repaid. The government cannot keep piling up debt indefinitely, for if it tries, it will someday become bankrupt. As Adam Smith observed in 1776, quote, "When national debts have once been accumulated to a certain degree, there is scarce, I believe, a single instance of their having been fairly and completely paid. The liberation of the public revenue, if it has even been brought about at all, has always been brought about by a bankruptcy, sometimes by an avowed one, but always by a real one, though frequently by a pretended payment." End quote. Yet when the government comes to repay the debt it has accumulated for public works, it must necessarily tax more heavily than it spends. In this later period, therefore, it must necessarily destroy more jobs than it creates. The extra heavy taxation then required does not merely take away purchasing power, it also lowers or destroys incentives to production, and so reduces the total wealth and income of the country. The only escape from this conclusion is to assume, as of course the apostles of spending always do, that the politicians in power will spend money only in what would otherwise have been depressed or quote-unquote deflationary periods, and will promptly pay the debt off in what would otherwise have been boom or quote-unquote inflationary periods. This is a beguiling fiction, but unfortunately the politicians in power have never acted that way. Economic forecasting, moreover, is so precarious, and the political pressures at work are of such a nature that governments are unlikely to ever act that way. Deficit spending, once embarked upon, creates powerful vested interests, which demand its continuance under all conditions. If no honest attempt is made to pay off the accumulated debt, and resort is had to outright inflation instead, then the results follow that we have already described. For the country as a whole cannot get anything without paying for it. Inflation itself is a form of taxation. It is perhaps the worst possible form, which usually bears hardest on those least able to pay. On the assumption that inflation affected everyone and everything evenly, which, as we have seen, is never true, it would be tantamount to a flat sales tax of the same percentage on all commodities, with the rate as high on bread and milk as on diamonds and furs. Or it might be thought of as equivalent to a flat tax of the same percentage without exemptions on everyone's income. It is a tax not only on every individual's expenditures, but on his savings account and life insurance. And it is, in fact, a flat capital levy without exemptions, in which the poor man pays as high a percentage as the rich man. But the situation is even worse than this because, as we have seen, inflation does not and cannot affect everyone evenly. Some suffer more than others. The poor are usually more heavily taxed by inflation in percentage terms than the rich, for they do not have the same means of protecting themselves by speculative purchases of real equities. Inflation is a kind of tax that is out of control of the tax authorities. It strikes wantonly in all directions. The rate of tax imposed by inflation is not a fixed one. It cannot be determined in advance. We know what it is today. We do not know what it will be tomorrow. And tomorrow we shall not know what it will be on the day after. Like every other tax, inflation acts to determine the individual and business policies we are all forced to follow. It discourages all prudence and thrift. It encourages squandering, gambling, reckless waste of all kinds. It often makes it more profitable to speculate than to produce. It tears apart the whole fabric of stable economic relationships. Its inexcusable injustices drive men toward desperate remedies. It plants the seeds of fascism and communism. It leads men to demand totalitarian controls. It ends invariably in bitter disillusion and collapse. That concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So before we get started, we need to talk about some primers on this incredibly long chapter that, yes, this is my review of the chapter. It is needlessly long. It was unnecessarily redundant. He could have easily made the chapter about half as long, and you guys know how much I favor concision. We're going to try to make this review as quickly as possible because, like I said, this was just a needlessly long read. So as a result, on that note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of plug some primers that I think are necessary for this video because we've talked a lot about the things that we're going to discuss in this video in previous videos. First things first, Hazlitt mentions several times the Wealth of Nations and takes direct quotations from it. And, well, we actually read The Wealth of Nations on this series, so I'll put a link to that series in this video's description so you can check that out because we'll be going over Smith's lesson too. I also need to mention the previous two videos in this series, so chapters 22 and 21. So if you haven't been following along if you're watching this video individually and not watching this as part of the playlist that is the entirety of Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, do go jump back to chapter 21, watch chapter 21, go to chapter 22, watch chapter 22. Like I say in the introduction to all these videos, there are timestamps in the video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review. So you can do that. Also, I have to do a plug as part of the primer to my series on interference. I'll link to that in this video's description, and that'll explain, again, some of these topics that we're going to talk about. It's going to explain Smith's lesson in great detail, and it's going to explain just exactly where some of these lessons come from in terms of what causes inflation, what inflation's effects are, and the actual proofs that allow you to get to these conclusions about inflation. So with that out of the way, the first lesson to be taken into account here is a lesson we've gone over 100 times on this channel and on my other channel as well. And again, this is a primer for the read itself. Money is nothing more than a medium of exchange. It is a means to an end, not the end itself. The thing you is the car, not the money that buys the car. The money doesn't get you to where you want to be. The thing you want is the television. The thing you want is Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, not the money it took to buy that. What can you actually do with that money? I guess you could wipe your behind with it. I suppose you could make a pillow out of it. Other than that, it is a medium of exchange. It is the means, not the end. And this is why in The Wealth of Nations, Smith is often uses the phrase a thing or the monetary price of a thing or the same thing, what can be exchanged for it. In fact, he uses it so often that I would consider it basically a meme within Smith and his writing. And that because money is nothing more than a medium of exchange, and it always represents the productivity. So it is nothing more than a stand-in for the productivity, right? So if I mow somebody's lawn, how do I exchange me mowing somebody's lawn for groceries at the grocery store? There's no great way to directly exchange that. So that's basically just a piece of paper saying this is me mowing somebody's lawn. So I can hand that in to the grocer in exchange for the food. So it always represents the productivity. So on that note, simply printing more of it just devalues the already existing supply. What happens when you flood the market with a supply of a good or service? The price goes down. Right. So if we have something like fractured rock drilling, for natural gas. When you flood the market with supply of natural gas, as a result of that, the price of natural gas goes down. This is economics that we learn just throughout the course of our daily lives, and not really a lesson that it comes from an economics course. We all kind of understand the fact that if you have an excess of something, the price of that thing will tend to go down. If the local hardware store buys way too much spray paint, how do they get rid of it? They lower the price. All right. So the basic lesson that we derive from these primers, from these previous lessons that we've gone over 100 times. I should also plug the video that I did on my other channel, which I'll put a link to in this video's description, about how price controls cause shortages, minimum wage causes unemployment. I'll put a link to that in this video's description as well. So the basic lesson to get out of tonight's read is extolled on pages 166 to 167. Either they never stop to remind themselves, yes, this is where we are. Collectively, they cannot buy twice as much goods as before unless twice as much goods are produced, or they imagine that so I'll read the whole sentence because it's in reference to people who are in favor, effectively, of monetary policy that is directly and deliberately causing inflation. Either they never stop to remind themselves that people collectively cannot buy twice as much goods as before unless twice as much goods are produced. So remember, money represents the production, not the actual physical paper itself. Or they imagine that the only thing that holds down an indefinite increase in production is not a shortage of manpower. Remember, that's that video we've referenced now a few times. Shortages cause, price floors, price controls cause shortages. In that case, when it comes to labor, minimum wage causes unemployment. Working hours are productive capacity, but merely a shortage of monetary demand. If people want the goods, they assume, and have the money to pay for them, the goods will almost automatically be produced. And this is antithesis to supply-side economics, which suggests that supply begets demand, not that demand begets supply. What was the demand for LED televisions in 1984? What was the demand for it? It can't possibly even be determined because in the time, at least, it couldn't have been determined because it didn't exist. So this notion is completely antithetical to supply-side economics, which is actually the economics that is talked about with the slander trickle-down theory. And Thomas Sowell actually goes into great detail as to what that means in his book, Trickle-Down Theory and Tax Cuts for the Rich. I actually read that on this channel. I'll put a link to this in this video's description to that, because I think that's actually really helpful when discussing the difference between demand-side and supply-side economics and the slanders that are leveled at the unfair slanders that are leveled at supply-side economics. So we just went over the basic lesson from the read today. Now let's get into just the condensed. Hazlitt restates a condensed version of this on page 171. The real purchasing power for goods, however, as we have seen, consists of other goods. It cannot be wondrously increased merely by printing more pieces of paper called dollars. So again, the currency isn't the ends. It is a means to an end. It's the way we get from one good or service to another good or service. And if you want people to get richer, not just in the short term, but also in the long term, you have to increase the goods or services. The medium is just the thing that allows you to get from A to B. You have to improve A and you have to improve B in order to improve A and B. And like I said, this one lesson comes from all the primers we talked about, and it actually is, to a certain extent, an extent of Hazlitt's one lesson, where the confusion about inflation is seeing one thing, only focusing in on one thing and not everything else, and all of the effects that concept has on a lot of other things. The Sargon would call it knock-on effects. And this is on page 171. So inflation turns out to be merely one more example of our central lesson. It may indeed bring benefits for a short time to favored groups, but only at the expense of others. And of course, all of the effects of inflation isn't just on prices, isn't just on wages, isn't just on these short-term things, but it also affects capital. Just a few sentences later on page 170. Even a relatively mild inflation distorts the structure of production. It leads to the overexpansion of some industries at the expense of others. This involves a misapplication and waste of capital. When the inflation collapses or is brought to a halt, the misdirected capital investment, whether in the form of machines, factories, or office buildings, cannot yield an adequate return and loses the greater part of its value. Again, this is an extension of Smith's lesson that when you have no interference with mutually consensual transactions, and inflation is necessarily one of those things that would interfere with those mutually consensual transactions. When you have none of that, that's how you have, when you don't have the interference, that's how we achieve the most effective distribution of scarce resources, the most effective allocation of scarce resources. And it's self-evidently true by virtue of the fact that the people that are making that exchange would not make that exchange unless they were getting more than what they were exchanging, what they were getting for, right? Farmer Brown isn't going to exchange for the ferrying, isn't going to exchange his oats for the ferrying services of Farrier Smith unless the ferrying services of Farrier Smith appear to be greater in value to Farmer Brown than the amount of oats he has to exchange for that service. This is self-evidently true. We've gone over this 100 times. Like I said, the two best sources for this would be my interference series, which is, again, linked in this video's description, or the previous two reads. So you guys can just go back into chapters 21 and 22 in this playlist. By the way, this is this concept, the effects on capital and the detriment that inflation has on capital and the long-term productive capacity of a country are exactly why the policies of FDR have been widely regarded by economists in hindsight as having actually extended the effects of the Great Depression significantly, and why the policies of the Warren Harding administration meant the crash of 1920 to 1921 and mostly of 1921 was over in a matter of months and nobody remembers it. And to be honest, most economists many economists at least, attribute to the existence of the Depression of 1920 to 1921 to the sort of monetary easement that Hazlitt is decrying in this read. Many economists attribute its existence in the first place to governmental inflationary intervention, which we'll get into in just a second. Now, this lesson is fairly straightforward, and the previous lessons we went over are the proof of that. So I talked about in a previous video about the difference between evidence and proof, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But this is antithetical to the insanity of Keynes and his mathematical/scientific approach and his velocity calculations that, he invented. You don't need to have all of these complicated mathematics when you already have the existing proof. You don't need to have an axiomatic statement that is self-evidently true. You don't need to have you don't need to complicate things any more than what is obviously already true. And this is a huge part of why when I read Keynes, I couldn't finish the book, aside from the fact that his basic understanding of finance was so out of line with what is the common understanding of finance, not just the common understanding of finance, but what is universally accepted is actually true about finance, that I don't even know how he comes to an actual conclusion about how he develops his general theory based on financial methods. So I'll put a link in this video's description to my review of that book, though. Like I said, I'll admit I only made it 6 or 7 chapters into that book because it was just so asinine. So like I said, these lessons are fairly straightforward, and you do not need Keynes's mathematics and velocity. Velocity, to me, I know what velocity is. It's the notion of how far and how fast does a dollar spread throughout an economy. Well, it's a complete aside. It's completely unnecessary. It's a complete irrelevant, made up. I'm going to call it a statistic. It's really not a statistic. It's just it's made up. It's just a buzzword that's useful in cramming down a political ideology. It doesn't actually tell you anything about how money actually works. It doesn't tell you anything about, say, what a dollar can actually get you, what goods will exchange for other goods at what rate. It doesn't tell you anything about, when I say rate, of course, how much of one good will actually purchase another good in market conditions. It doesn't tell you anything about actual standards of living. It doesn't tell you anything about accumulated productivity. It doesn't tell you anything about the productivity itself. It's a completely useless, made-up bunch of jargon. And again, this harkens back to proof versus evidence. When we already have the proof, when we already say, if A, then B, therefore I have A, therefore B. So if the premise is if A, then B, and A, therefore B, right? So this is a bit of a tautology, but at the same time, it's obviously and axiomatically true. Then we don't need any to complicate, if A, then B, more than just if A, then B. If you have the proof of if A, then B, we talked about this in another read, actually, and I believe it was one of our reads in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. So again, link to that series is in this video's description. But there's a difference between proof and evidence. If you can prove, like Einstein did, that light will bend around the sun from other stars, so such that if you have a complete solar eclipse, you'll be able to see with super high-power telescopes stars whose alignment in the universe that are actually behind the sun, that we shouldn't be able to see, except during a total eclipse. Total solar eclipse, we'll be able to see that dot right on the edge of that total solar eclipse. And we don't actually need the evidence that we only very recently were able to achieve, because you need absolutely dream conditions that, are absolutely lottery ticket odds luck of getting. So in that case, Einstein was correct by virtue of the fact that he had the proof that was correct. We didn't need to actually evidence those claims, though now that we have the evidence, we've witnessed those claims actually taking effect for the first time. So, and on that note, you can kind of, if you are confused by the example that Hazlitt gave on pages 168 to 169, you can just skip it. This is really nothing more than the first mover advantage. So when you are the first company, when you are the first entrant into a market, be that a market based on geography, or a market based on a technology, or a market based on a sector, or a market based on really anything, you have the advantage of being the first one there. Apple has the advantage of having been the first iPhone. Microsoft, for the longest time, had the advantage of, well, it wasn't necessarily Microsoft as much, but Windows had the advantage of being the first PC to make use of a user interface designed around the intuitive concept of a physical desktop, right? When you were the first mover, if you're the first hardware store to move into town, you have the advantage of being the first one. You've already expended that capital. You've already built up the rapport in the community. You've already built the trust in the community. It's really nothing more than the first mover advantage that he's explaining there in pages 168 to 169. Not in the same way that a hardware store moving into town, being the first hardware store to move into town, is the first mover advantage. But what it is if you're the first one to just get money handed to you from money printer go burr monetary policy, then you're the one that gets the advantage of having been the first one to get that. So you now have more money to buy more things. What that means is that those prices are going to go up while you have excess money, but while a whole bunch of other people don't. While everyone else's money is not stagnating, but actually decreasing in price. So what is inflation? Really, inflation is the artificial pumping up of prices. So in this case, when you have those artificial pumping up of prices by an excess of supply, right? So because the value of the dollar is what winds up going down. You have excess dollars. Therefore, what they will fetch will go down. You will need more dollars to get those things. Therefore, if it takes person A and person B both more dollars to get those things that they want, then the person A, who just happens to have been the first one to get that money, will be able to overcome the inflationary adjustment before that other person. And that inflationary adjustment won't happen until those exchanges are made, until that money gets to that other person. This is actual trickle-down economics. This is actual trickling down of that handout to person A that will have to eventually get spent on person B, will have to eventually get spent on person C, will have to eventually get exchanged with person D, until basically all of those price levels level out to where they were previously in real terms, right? And in the meantime, during those corrections, government has effectively played favorites with those who received those monies in the first place. And again, this speaks to the misdirection of productivity and spending. So if you didn't have that governmental interference with mutually consensual transactions, that money would have been self-evidently and axiomatically spent in other places necessarily. That would have been, again, a better allocation of those resources, so that at the end you wind up getting, the tide that floats all boats. You wind up getting a net increase in productivity. You don't have resources allocated to, say, less productive means necessarily. You have them allocated to things that have to be exchanged for other goods or services. So we're getting a little bit long in the tooth. That's all we're really talking about here with this chapter, is just simply that when you increase the supply, when you have an excess of supply of a good or service, the price of that good or services goes down, and the price is, like Adam Smith said, the same as what it will fetch at market. So if the price of, let's say, US dollars goes down, that means that the amount of goods or services that they will fetch goes down. And of course, those who have that money printed out and handed to them first are the ones that are going to overcome that inflationary effect quicker than those who don't. So that's what Hazlitt was talking about when he's talking about manufacturer A, manufacturer B, manufacturer C, manufacturer D. The one that is furthest down that line is going to be the one that is most adversely affected. And of course, because all of those other groups are adversely affected by virtue of the misallocation and misdirection of productivity and spending, everyone is affected adversely by this misallocation and misdirection of productivity and spending. So that concludes our analysis and review of Chapter 3. We'll continue in this series with Chapter 24, which is entitled The Assault on Saving. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.